Good day. Today is Thursday, 5th June 2025, and as you can see, I'm somewhat formally dressed because I've been coming out of meetings, panels here in Tbilisi. There have been absolutely fascinating meetings. I've learnt an awful lot from the various contributors, from people like Ambassador Matlock, my colleague and Glenn Deason, Ian Proud, Matthew Blackburn, Paul Grenier, Nikolai Petro, many others, people who have been coming to this country to discuss the state of international relations at this particular time. So, as I said, I'm going from one panel to another, but it's important that I do a program, and I'm doing it now because later this evening I'm invited out to a special event which I don't want to miss. So, let me first of all apologize again for the brevity of this program. Tomorrow there will be an abundance of free time and I will be able to do a program of more normal length. But in the meantime, a great deal is continuing to take place, and there is, it seems to me now, a clear rise in the diplomatic pressure around the conflict in Ukraine. Briefly, the negotiations that have been taking place between Russia and Ukraine hang by a thread. There is now a clear pattern of escalation in Europe, and at the same time the presidents of Russia and the president of the United States seem to be anxiously trying to find some way to try and avoid the situation escalating entirely out of control. So let's first of all discuss President Zalinski, because President Zalinski has been speaking and he has said that the memorandum that the Russians presented to the Ukrainians at the meeting in Istanbul was completely unacceptable, that there is really no point in wasting further time in negotiations, the kind of negotiations that have been taking place in Istanbul in that sort of format. The only type of negotiations that make any kind of sense, according to Zalinski, are negotiations that take place directly between Vladimir Putin and himself. In other words, he's again demanding a one-to-one meeting with President Putin. I say a one-to-one meeting, though I'm not entirely sure about that. There are some suggestions from various Ukrainian sources that he actually wants the meeting to involve President Trump of the United States as well, though it's not clear that President Trump is interested in that, and the Russians, President Putin, obviously is not. So that's President Zalinski. Now, his words, if one takes them literally, imply that Ukraine has decided that it's going to pull out of the Istanbul negotiations, that it is not interested in the Istanbul negotiations any further, in which case the entire Istanbul process has come to a juddering stop. And it will be Zalinski, rather than the Russians, who will have pulled the plug on it. Yesterday, I said that President Putin seemed pretty much at the limit of his patience with Ukraine's conduct. But I also said that other Russian officials, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Russian chief negotiator Vladimir Medinsky, still seem to think that there was some point in continuing with the Istanbul negotiations. And before the meeting that took place in Moscow yesterday broke up, Putin made it clear that he was going to have further discussions with Lavrov specifically and with Medinsky, probably about whether or not the moment had indeed come for Russia to pull out of the negotiations. Zalinski appears to have preempted that. He's all but saying that Ukraine will not participate in any further discussions within the Istanbul format at all. Now, that, of course, is what Zalinski is saying. If the Americans tell him that they're not interested in what he thinks about the Istanbul process. He must participate in it. They insist that he goes, or at least that he sends his delegates. Then perhaps he will do as he's done on the two previous occasions, and he will back down and he will send his representatives to Istanbul or wherever the next meeting will be, and that the words that Zalinski is saying now will just, as I said, fade into the ether. It's not impossible, but for the moment he appears to be calling time on the entire Istanbul process, and he's done so before President Putin of Russia has formally done so, if it is indeed the case that President Putin is indeed thinking of doing anything like that. So that is one part of the escalation that is taking place. The other part comes from Germany. Now, the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, has been making some extremely aggressive statements. He says that Ukraine is on the brink of using its weapons, the ones with unlimited range, which it has developed with Germany's assistance, and these weapons will be put into operation within the next couple of days. Now, if these weapons are missiles, well, it is conceivable, I suppose, that the Germans have been helping Ukraine to manufacture long-range missiles, though I can't see how that could have been done in Ukraine itself. More probably, it would have been done in Germany. But that decision to start co-manufacturing of long-range missiles with Ukraine would have to have been decided during the time of Olaf Scholz, and presumably the missiles would have to be based on the Taurus missile, because that is the only long-range cruise missile that Germany has. Just to say. Now, there is a much, much more simple explanation to this, and that is that the Taurus missiles, as I recently said in a program, that they have already been delivered to Ukraine. The Germans and the Ukrainians are going through a fictitious narrative that these missiles have somehow been replaced or put together or screwed together or manufactured even in Ukraine itself. Unless you believe that Olaf Scholz authorized the production of Taurus missiles on Ukrainian territory when he was Chancellor, or unless you believe that Boris Pistorius and the German Defense Ministry and the German military-industrial complex was working behind Olaf Scholz's back and was working to build Taurus missiles in Ukraine without Chancellor Scholz being informed about it, which is possible, but I have to say, I think extremely unlikely, well, then the only logical explanation is the one that I gave a few days ago, that these are indeed Taurus missiles, that they were sent by Germany to Ukraine. Maybe they were sent in some kind of prefabricated format. Ukraine is then being assisted to screw them all back together again, and they are therefore ready for launch. So it is an overcomplicated, intricate way of getting round German law, fooling the German public, fooling the Russians, except, of course, that I don't believe that any one of these parties is indeed going to be fooled. And the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is on his way to the United States. As we know, the Taurus missile requires targeting data to be provided by the United States if it is to be used against targets in pre-2014 Russia. GPS, which is the alternative guidance method, does not work on Russian territory, just saying. Or, and in addition, the Taurus missile uses apparently American military components, which prevent it from being used at all without the express permission of the United States. So surely, logically, we can put all this together. And what Boris Pistorius is saying is that Merz is expecting, when he arrives in Washington, to have a meeting there with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump to give the green light to the Germans to enable them to help the Ukrainians to use the Taurus missiles in strikes against Russia. It's an extraordinary operation. It must have begun not just not when Merz actually became Chancellor. It must have been initiated for this to have been done so quickly, presumably by Pistorius, in the days or weeks before Merz became Chancellor, presumably in the interregnum between the German election and Merz's actual appointment as Chancellor. But as I said, it's an overcomplicated, over-clever device to try to get the Taurus missiles used in Ukraine against Russia at a time when the Ukrainians have already been engaging in a pattern of escalation. Now, it's not just the Germans, it's also some people in the United States as well. Senators Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham have been in Kiev, they've been touring Europe, they've been making all kinds of very threatening statements about their tariff proposals against China, not really against Russia at all, but never mind. They've been saying that more forcible measures need to be used to force the Russians to the negotiating table, and that that Donald Trump has relied too much on charm, and now the time has come for more kinetic measures so that Russia agrees to a just settlement of the conflict, in other words, capitulates. And I can't help but think that Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal, who are now threatening to present their bill to Congress next week, to the Senate next week, where they claim or believe that it will have overwhelming approval, I can't help but think that Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham have been coordinating with the Europeans, with the Germans specifically, and quite plausibly with hardliners within the administration itself, people perhaps like General Kellogg, though exactly what General Kellogg is involved in agreeing to and what role precisely he's playing anymore, I'm not frankly sure. So you can see the pattern of escalation that is now taking place. The attacks on Russia, the drone attacks on the air bases, the bombs in the railways in western Russia, in Bryansk and Kursk region, the drone attacks on the Crimean Bridge, the further attacks on Zaporozhye and Kherson region, the Russian-controlled parts of Zaporozhye and Kherson region, with the attempt to cut people off from electric power there, the use of the Taurus missiles, if I'm correct about that, and the bone-crunching sanctions that Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal have been talking about. Now, there is resistance to this. It turns out that some European countries have resisted attempts to impose further sanctions on Russia in coordination with Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal next week. So that further sanction step from the Europeans has been delayed, and it also seems that other US officials are starting to take a different line on the conflict altogether. So By way of example, Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, has again stayed away from the Ramstein summit meeting of Western supporters of Ukraine. He appears to be following the president's line and what could be said to be the administration's line of gradually ending military support for Ukraine. And there have been other steps taken by other US officials as well. It seems, for example, that the US at the moment is not supporting British and European proposals to reduce the oil price cap on Russian oil that can be moved by tankers insured in the London insurance market. So we can see that there's been some resistance from some levels, but we can also see that the hardliners have been manoeuvring, and they've been manoeuvring in what looks to me, frankly, like coordinated fashion ever since maybe the meeting between the Ukrainians and the Russians on the 16th of May. They were expecting before that meeting that massive sanctions would be imposed on Russia by the Trump administration if the Russians did not agree to the 30-day unconditional ceasefire. They were very angry and frustrated when that didn't happen after Donald Trump backed Putin's proposal made on the 11th of May for direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to begin. But the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and some people in the United States, the hardliners in the United States, have now recovered their footing, and they're now pushing back hard, and they're trying to push towards a full and outright escalation, even as Zalinski himself is now openly calling for the termination of the Istanbul process. So that is one side. Now there is the other side, and that is Donald Trump himself and some of the people who are close to him. And I discussed yesterday the telephone call that he had with Putin. Now, the Russians have not published a readout of this call, but they have done something in some ways rather more useful, which is that Yuri Ushakov, Putin's aide, has now provided a detailed account of the call. And this is what he said, and it's taken from the Kremlin's website. About an hour ago, the fourth telephone conversation between our president and US President Trump concluded. In case you want to know, this time it lasted approximately 70 minutes. What did the conversation begin with? Naturally, it began with a discussion of the situation around Ukraine. Vladimir Putin provided detailed information on the outcomes of the second round of direct Russian-Ukrainian talks in Istanbul. It was emphasized that Ukraine tried to derail these talks by carrying out targeted attacks on entirely civilian targets and civilians on direct orders from the Kiev regime. These attacks unequivocally constitute an act of terrorism under international law, and, in our view, the Kiev regime has essentially degenerated into a terrorist organization. Now, this is actually a change in language, because Putin said yesterday that the Kiev regime, as he called it, the Ukrainian government, is gradually degenerating into a terrorist organization. Ushakov is now saying that the Kiev regime has essentially degenerated into a terrorist organization. I don't think this is a slip, by the way. Just to say, I think that there is now consensus within the Russian political structures that this is indeed so. And then Ushakov then went on to say this: the Russian side did not fall for the provocations, and as you know, the second round has effectively taken place in Istanbul. Our president extensively covered the content and outcomes of the talks and emphasized that overall these talks were productive productive, not in terms, obviously, of moving forward in terms of the war itself, but in terms of exchanging prisoners and that sort of thing. But then Ushakov goes on to say this: the corresponding memorandums exchanged hands and will be analysed in the capitals, Moscow and Kiev, and then we hope both sides can continue the talks. So that is a clear indication, perhaps a confirmation, that after his discussions with Lavrov, Putin has agreed that for the moment, Russian interests are best served by continuing with the Istanbul process. And then Ushakov went on to say this: regarding the strikes on military airfields, this issue was also discussed. Donald Trump reiterated that Americans were not informed in advance about them. Now, I suspect that is true, or could be true, about Trump himself. I still find it very difficult to believe that nobody in the United States knew about this in advance. Just saying. And I am sure that other people in Europe knew about this in advance. Now, this issue has become, this attack on the airfields has become a very big issue within the MAGA movement in the United States, and rightly so, by the way. So, Donald Trump's first ever national security advisor, General Michael Flynn, has written an anguished but very compelling statement, making a number of points about this attack. He has explained that the reason the Russian aircraft were laid out on the runways unprotected is because this has been a long-standing agreement between the United States and Russia in order that each side is able to monitor at all times the state of the strategic aviation of the other. The aircraft, strategic bombers, are not squirreled away and hidden away in ways that might make it possible for them to be armed with nuclear weapons and sent to the attack, to attack the other without the other knowing. So this is a long-standing, confidence-building measure, effectively and essentially agreed by both sides. Ukraine took advantage of it to attack the Russian strategic bombers. And Flynn went on to say that this attack not only was a blow against Russia, but therefore, and in the way it was done, it is a blow to US security overall, and it is clearly an attempt, again, by Ukraine and its European allies to draw the United States into outright conflict with Russia, a nuclear conflict with Russia. Others who have been speaking out strongly about this have included Tucker Carlson, I believe Donald Trump Jr., though I haven't seen any specific comment that he has made, and I understand that there has been quite a lot of concern about this attack on the part of the MAGA movement as well. Also, other people who are not members of the MAGA movement, like, for example, the former CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who is now, of course, a co-founder and co-chair, I believe, of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He's written an excellent piece about this whole attack for Consortium News, and you can see what he writes there and the concerns that he has. Now, one thing I would say is that all of these people who are expressing their concern about this attack appear to accept the Ukrainian claim that up to 40 bombers were destroyed as true. In fact, we now have quite extensive satellite data from the Russian airfields, and it seems that the number of Russian bombers actually destroyed might have been no more than 3. And for what it's worth, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, is now coming forward and saying that basically that no aircraft were completely destroyed. Some were damaged, some more damaged than others, but that all of the aircraft are repairable. Well, I am not going to get into a deeper discussion about this, but one can see that people who are close to Trump and who are members of his base are extremely alarmed about this, and they feel that, again, Ukraine is taking steps to draw the United States into an armed conflict with Russia. And Donald Trump himself therefore went out of his way, and that's basically what Ushakov's account is telling us, went out of his way to reassure Putin that the United States was not involved in the attack on the air bases, that it was not an attack on the air bases by the United States. Notice that this does not extend to NATO. Ushakov does not say that Trump said that NATO was not involved. He said that Americans were not informed, which is a different thing. So that leaves open the possibility that countries like Britain, France, and Germany might have been involved. But anyway, Trump is making it clear to the Russians, to Putin, that he was not involved and that the Americans altogether were not involved either. As I said, you might have doubts about the second, but anyway, Trump was anxious to make it clear that he had absolutely no part in any of this at all. And then Ushakov continues, naturally the leaders agreed to continue contacts on the Ukraine issue, both at the highest level and through other channels as well. In addition to Ukraine, a number of other international issues were discussed, with a focus on the stalled talks between the United States and Iran on the Iranian nuclear program. I discussed this yesterday. Donald Trump has been much more forthcoming about this. The Russians are deeply involved, as it turns out, in the Iran-US negotiations, as I said they would be back in January. And we go on to read, Trump believes that Russia's assistance may be necessary here, and he would appreciate it if Russia could work with the Iranian side accordingly. Additionally, the Middle East was discussed, as well as the armed conflict between India and Pakistan, which has been halted with the personal involvement of President Trump. The Indians, by the way, don't accept the last point, but never mind. Furthermore, the presidents exchanged views on the prospects for restoring Russian-US cooperation in various areas, which, according to both presidents, possess enormous potential. Now, that suggests that Trump is now going to come out and speak against Lindsey Graham's and Senator Blumenthal's bone-crushing sanctions. I mean, you can't continue cooperation against a country that you are acting against in that sort of way, or at least that is what I would have thought. So anyway, that is what the leaders had to say about that. And then again, according to Ushakov, we go on to read that both leaders characterized the exchange of views as positive and highly productive. President Trump and our president also confirmed their willingness to remain in constant communication. I would note that both Trump and Putin highly appreciated the efforts of President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff. That is all I can share about the outcomes of the telephone conversation, which is, by the way, an admission that more was discussed than Ushakov actually is telling us. And it'd be very interesting to know what it was, but I suspect that Trump was explaining to Putin some of the extreme pressures that he feels he's under within the United States itself. So we can see that things are hanging by a thread. The Hardliners are gathering. They're making a major push to wreck the Istanbul talks. Putin and Trump are trying to keep the process going, and it looks like Trump is going to try to stop in its tracks the sanctions that Graham and Blumenthal are seeking. It will be very interesting indeed to be a fly on the wall when Trump and Merz meet in Washington. Judging from this discussion, Trump is probably going to tell Merz that the United States does not support the use of Taurus missiles in strikes against Russia, and it could be that there will be a row between Merz and Trump. There's been a lot of commentary in Germany about how Merz has been given advice not to get into a row with Trump. My sense of Merz is that he has a very, very short temper. I can very easily see how the whole thing can explode. Now, in the meantime, the war goes on. The Russians continue to push westwards. I'm not going to discuss any of that in this program. What I would say is that I read another article talking about the disastrous situation in Ukraine's air defenses. Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, no less, has said that Germany has given up to a quarter of its air defense missiles to Ukraine, its Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. It simply cannot give any more. Ukraine is down to perhaps a couple of score of Patriot missile interceptors. There doesn't seem to be any rush by any other country to supply Patriot missile interceptors. And the United States doesn't seem to be keen on that idea either, because it seems that though Raytheon is trying to increase production of Patriot missile interceptors to around 600 a year, that is nowhere near enough to cover Ukraine's needs, let alone those of the allies of the United States and of the United States itself. So the hardliners seem intent to continue the war, even though they can see that the war is being lost. I can just about understand what Zalinski himself is up to. From his point of view, ending the war would probably be a disaster. It would mean that he would be faced with elections. He would probably lose power. His rivals in Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, Petro Poroshenko, the former president, Yulia Tymoshenko would be after him. Probably the Banderites would be after him as well. And, of course, the flow of money to Ukraine would also stop. So Zalinski, I can just about understand why he wants the war to continue. And by the way, I go along with Simon Schuster's view expressed in that article written way back in December 2023 that Zalinski has by now developed some kind of a messiah complex and is incapable of seeing this thing in any kind of objective way. So I can understand the Ukrainians. I can just about understand people like Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal. From their point of view, ultimately, if all goes wrong and if Ukraine goes down to defeat, well, the United States continues to be a continent and an ocean away. It remains a superpower. They can blame everybody else and say that it's everybody else's fault, not theirs. And if things had been done more aggressively earlier by Joe Biden, Donald Trump himself, or whoever, that's what that outcome would have been avoided. But the attitude of the leaders of Europe, the attitude of the German government in particular, I find incomprehensible. German MPs and the CDU are now demanding that Germany expel all Russian diplomats from German territory, meaning in effect that Germany end diplomatic relations with Russia. I have absolutely no idea what planet these people are living on. I presume that all of this is a drumbeat in preparation for the banning of the AfD party in Germany, which will no doubt be classified as a pro-Russian party, a cat's paw of Vladimir Putin, run from the Kremlin in some unexplained and mysterious way. But as I said, none of this makes any kind of sense to me in terms of German national interests. One would have thought that Germany, more than any other country, would know that getting into an open-ended confrontation with Russia is a disaster, especially for Germany. But I get the sense that Friedrich Merz and some of the people around him have an almost visceral loathing of Russia, which, as I said, astonishes me, and which I suspect has very deep roots, and which has now risen to the surface. And it looks as if all of those old ghosts and demons from the past, which I once assumed had been banished, are still in Germany, alive and well. So, terrible decision-making there, and of course terrible decision-making across Europe. I have been attending, as I said, this conference in Georgia. It is partly about events in Georgia, but it is also about events in Europe generally, because, of course, Georgia is part of this geostrategic space. And the Georgians are very concerned about all of this. I'm perhaps going further than they're saying when I say that they are deeply alarmed by European policy. But I don't think, if I am going further than what they're actually saying, that I am going further than what many of them are actually thinking. I would have thought that even more than the Americans, the Europeans would be trying to bring this conflict, which is going to end in disaster for them, to an end. No, they want to escalate it instead. They want to launch missiles into Russia. They back all of these escalatory moves by Zalinski. As the Russian media has been pointing out, they're not criticizing Zalinski and the Ukrainians at all for the attack on the train in Bryansk. There's criticisms of Russian actions which result in the deaths of civilians. There is no criticism of Ukrainian actions when these appear to target civilians. Just saying. So what exactly the Europeans think they're doing, I simply don't know. There is that famous expression, which some people attribute to Euripides and the ancient Greeks, but may actually be French and date from the 19th century, that those whom the gods destroy, they first make mad. I think in Europe we are collectively going mad, but there it is. Whether anybody in the United States who is fighting back against this madness can bring us back is an open and very complicated question. Well, there it is. This is where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. This is this is the end of my program today. If you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Good day.